August 31st, 1944. If General George Smith Patton hadn't made the decision he was about to make in the next 72 hours, 30,000 United States soldiers would have been trapped, slaughtered, and the entire liberation of France would have ground to a catastrophic halt. Not delayed, not postponed, halted. The man they called Old Blood and Guts, a nickname earned through years of leading from the front, charging into battle while other generals commanded from behind the lines, was standing on the banks of the Meuse River, binoculars trained eastward. He could smell victory. He could see the Rhine River in his mind. He could envision the end of the war. General George Smith Patton's Third Army had done the impossible. They had broken the stalemate in Normandy. They had raced 400 miles in 30 days. They had liberated Paris. They were a dragon-breathing fire across France, consuming every German position in their path. Patton's tanks were the pride of the United States military, the spearhead that was supposed to end the war by Christmas. And then, the unthinkable happened. The dragon stopped. Not because of a German panzer division, not because of a fortress, not because Old Blood and Guts had lost his nerve, but because of a hose, a fuel hose. Supreme Commander Dwight David Eisenhower made a fateful decision that would haunt the campaign. He diverted the precious gasoline supplies north to Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery for a gamble called Operation Market Garden. George Smith Patton was left dry. His tanks, those magnificent machines that had terrified the Wehrmacht across France, were sitting on the side of the road in the Verdun sector. Their engines were silent, their crews were furious, and Patton was apoplectic. He screamed at General Omar Bradley, his superior officer and old friend. "Damn it, Brad! Just give me 400,000 gallons of gas and I'll be inside Germany in 2 days." The veins in his neck bulged. His pearl-handled pistols gleamed in the afternoon sun. But the answer was no. For 5 agonizing days, Old Blood and Guts sat still. And while he sat, the Germans regrouped. The disorganized retreat stopped. The enemy dug in. Units that had been running in panic suddenly found their backbone. And right in front of George Smith Patton, the ancient city of Nancy transformed from an open door into a fortress. Nancy is the jewel of Lorraine. It is a city of golden gates, Baroque squares, and medieval history stretching back centuries. But geographically, it is a nightmare for an attacker. To the west, it is protected by the Moselle River, a natural moat that had defended the city for 1,000 years. To the east, it is guarded by a spine of high ridges known as the Grande Couronne. The Germans knew this ground. They had fought here in World War I. They understood its defensive value. General Johannes Blaskowitz, commanding German Army Group G, realized that if he could hold Nancy, he could stop Patton. He could stop the entire Third Army. He poured reinforcements into the city, the 3rd and 15th Panzer Grenadier Divisions. Elite troops, veterans. They mined the bridges. They sighted their artillery on every crossroad. They turned Nancy into a death trap. Inside the city, and the French civilian administration was terrified. They had heard the rumors. They knew Old Blood and Guts was coming. They knew his reputation. Blood and guts. His guts, your blood, the soldiers used to joke darkly. The mayor, along with the prefect of the region, sent a secret courier through the lines under cover of darkness. The message arrived at 12th Corps headquarters, commanded by Major General Manton Eddy. The French message was desperate, pleading, almost begging. It essentially said, "We are an unprotected city. We have no military value. If you attack us, the Germans will blow up the place Stanislas. They will destroy our cathedral. They will burn our history. Please, General, bypass us. Do not enter. We formally refuse to open our gates to combat." General Eddy brought the news to Patton on September 4th, 1944. Eddy was a cautious man, methodical, careful. He suggested they might listen to the French plea to avoid civilian casualties. After all, Nancy was a beautiful city. It would be a shame to destroy it. George Smith Patton looked at Eddy. Then he looked at the map spread across the hood of his Jeep. He pointed his riding crop directly at the city, tapping it hard against the paper. "I don't care about their history," Patton growled, his voice like gravel. "I care about that river. The bridges in that city are the only way my tanks get east. You tell that mayor I'm coming, and you tell him to keep his head down." But Old Blood and Guts had done it again. The mayor had refused to open the gates, and Patton was about to show the world exactly what happens when you tell George Smith Patton no. This is what happened next. On September 5th, 1944, General George Smith Patton stood in the command tent, surrounded by his corps commanders. Maps covered every surface. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and tension. Outside, the rumble of distant artillery rolled like thunder. Major General Manton Eddy cleared his throat. "Sir, the French have made their position clear. They're asking us, no, they're begging us to go around Nancy. They say the Germans have wired the entire city center with explosives." Patton's jaw tightened. "And what do you propose, Manton? That we walk around every pretty city in France? That we let the Krauts decide where we can and cannot go? Sir, the civilian casualties could be... The casualties will be worse if we don't end this war," Old Blood and Guts snapped. "Every day we sit here, every day we accommodate these requests, is another day the Germans get stronger, another day they build defenses, another day United States boys die because we were too polite." General Walton Walker, commanding the 20th Corps, leaned forward. "George, even if we ignore the French request, a direct assault on Nancy is suicide. The Moselle River is a natural fortress. The Germans have had 5 days to prepare. 5 days we gave them because Monty needed our gas for his little adventure." Patton's eyes flashed. Everyone in the tent knew better than to mention the fuel situation. It was a wound that hadn't healed. "Then we don't assault it directly," George Smith Patton said quietly. Too quietly. When Old Blood and Guts spoke softly, it meant his mind was moving at lightning speed. "We go around, we cross north of the city. We cross south of the city, and we strangle it." "Sir, the 80th Infantry Division tried to cross north at Pont-à-Mousson yesterday," Eddy interjected. "It was a bloodbath. The Germans were waiting. They cut our boys to pieces in the water." Patton slammed his hand on the table. "I know what happened at Pont-à-Mousson. I was there. I saw the bodies floating in that damn river. But what do you want me to do? Give up? Tell Washington that George Smith Patton can't cross a river? That Old Blood and Guts is afraid of a little water?" The tent fell silent. Patton took a deep breath, composing himself. When he spoke again, his voice carried that peculiar mixture of profanity and poetry that made him legendary. "Gentlemen, let me tell you something about fear. The Germans are afraid. That French mayor is afraid. Hell, I think some of you are afraid. But you know what? Fear is a reaction. Courage is a decision. And I have decided that we are crossing that river, entering that city, and continuing this war. The only question is how." He turned to his operations officer. "Colonel, get me every engineer battalion we have. Get me every pontoon bridge, every rubber raft, every piece of rope in the Third Army. We're going to cross that river, and we're going to do it in multiple places simultaneously. The Krauts can't defend everywhere." "And the mayor's request?" Eddy asked. George Smith Patton smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You tell that mayor that his refusal to open the gates is noted. And you tell him that General George Smith Patton doesn't need gates. We'll make our own doors." But could Old Blood and Guts really pull it off? The Moselle River had stopped armies for centuries. The Germans had turned it into a killing ground, and time was running out. Every hour that passed, the German defenses grew stronger. Every hour, the window of opportunity closed a little more. The next 72 hours would tell whether George Smith Patton was a genius or a madman. And 30,000 United States soldiers were betting their lives on the answer. September 5th, 1944, 1100 hours. The second attempt to cross the Moselle River north of Nancy began in blood and chaos. The 80th Infantry Division, still recovering from yesterday's disaster, slipped their boats back into the water at Pont-à-Mousson. The men were silent, grim-faced. They had seen what happened to their buddies 24 hours earlier. As soon as the boats hit the middle of the river, the dark hills erupted. Machine gun fire tore through the rubber rafts like a chainsaw through paper. Mortars turned the Moselle red with United States blood. Men screamed, boats overturned, bodies floated downstream. The 80th Division was thrown back again with devastating casualties. George Smith Patton drove to the front in his Jeep, standing upright despite the shell fire, his polished helmet gleaming. He saw the broken bodies being carried back. He saw the fear in the eyes of his battalion commanders. General Eddy, who had accompanied him, suggested they pause and regroup. Maybe wait a week for more artillery. maybe coordinate with other units. This was the moment that defined the campaign. This was the moment that separated Old Blood and Guts from every other general in the European theater. A lesser commander would have waited. The mayor of Nancy would have gotten his wish. But George Smith Patton grabbed General Eddie by the lapels and pulled him close, his face inches away. "Manton, I don't want to hear about what you can't do," Patton growled. "You have to cross this river. If you don't, the Germans will turn this whole valley into a graveyard. Every day we wait, they get stronger. Every day we sit, United States soldiers die. Now, find another way. Or, I'll find another corps commander." He released Eddie and turned to the regimental commanders gathered around. "Gentlemen, the enemy thinks he's beaten us. He thinks one bloody nose will make us quit, but he doesn't know who he's fighting. He doesn't know what Old Blood and Guts and the Third Army are made of. We are going across that river, not next week, not next month, tonight." The Americans found a weak spot. A few miles south of the failed crossing, near a town called Dieu-Louard, the river bent sharply. The German defenses were thinner there, not weak, but thinner. Aerial reconnaissance had spotted it. Now George Smith Patton was gambling everything on it. On the night of September 11th, 1944, under the cover of a heavy rainstorm that turned the world into a curtain of water, the 80th Infantry Division tried again. This time, they moved differently. No artillery preparation that would alert the Germans. No shouting, no lights. Just the sound of rain hammering on helmets and the splash of oars cutting through dark water. As Lieutenant Colonel Marvin Troxell led the first wave personally, his orders from Old Blood and Guts were simple. Get across or don't come back. The boats pushed off at 0200 hours. The men could barely see the opposite shore. The current was strong, swollen by the rain. They paddled silently, every man expecting the darkness to explode with German fire at any second. They reached the far bank. A German sentry called out, his voice uncertain in the rain. "Where da?" An American sergeant named Jake Morrison didn't hesitate. He lunged forward and silenced the sentry with his knife. The patrol moved inland, hearts pounding. They were across. Within an hour, 2 battalions of United States infantry had crossed the Moselle at Dieu-Louard. By dawn on September 12th, they had secured a bridgehead half a mile deep. But infantry alone couldn't exploit a breakthrough. George Smith Patton needed his tanks across. He needed them now. The engineers worked like demons possessed. They built a heavy treadway bridge in conditions that would have been considered impossible by any other army. They worked under sporadic German artillery fire, in pouring rain, in darkness. When a shell hit the bridge and killed 3 engineers, their buddies kept working, shoving the bodies aside. This was Patton's Third Army. They didn't stop. As dawn broke on September 12th, 1944, the first Sherman tanks of the 4th Armored Division began to roll across the pontoon bridge at Dieu-Louard. The metal treads clanked against the wet planking. The bridge swayed under the weight, but it held. This was George Smith Patton's favorite division. He called them the best damned armored division in the world, and he meant it. And leading the spearhead was a man who would become a legend in his own right, Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, a tank commander who shared Patton's aggressive philosophy. Abrams was Old Blood and Guts in miniature. He didn't believe in stopping. His philosophy was brutally simple. If you stop, you become a target. If you move, the enemy panics. He commanded from the front tank, always visible, always pushing forward. George Smith Patton personally met Abrams at the bridgehead. Rain dripped from both men's helmets. Patton looked at the young colonel and grinned. "Creighton, I'm giving you the best mission in this war," Patton said. "Bypass Nancy, circle behind it, cut off the German retreat. Don't stop for anything, not for roadblocks. Not for orders from anyone but me, not even if you drive off the map. You keep moving until you run out of gas or Germans. Understood?" "Yes, sir," Abrams replied. "What if we encounter heavy resistance?" "Drive through it," Old Blood and Guts said flatly. "You're not a cork, you're a corkscrew. You don't push, you twist. Keep moving, and they'll never get a clear shot at you. This is why I made you. This is your moment. Don't waste it." Creighton Abrams unleashed hell. His column of Sherman tanks tore through the French countryside, behind German lines like a steel hurricane. They drove so fast, they literally drove off their own maps, navigating by compass and instinct. They were capturing German supply trucks that were still driving toward the front. The drivers stunned to see United States tanks in their rear. Abrams tankers shot up headquarters units, supply depots, and communication centers. Chaos spread through the German rear areas like wildfire. Inside Nancy, the German garrison commander, Colonel Heinrich Müller, realized something was catastrophically wrong. The Americans weren't attacking the city gates like he had expected. They weren't throwing themselves against his prepared defenses. They were behind him. The pincer movement was closing. The 80th Infantry Division pressed from the north. The 35th Infantry Division pressed from the south. And Abrams' 4th Armored Division was cutting the road to Metz, the main German escape route. The mayor's refusal to open the gates had actually worked in Patton's favor, and it forced George Smith Patton to execute a double envelopment maneuver that was now trapping the entire German garrison. But the Germans weren't done, not by a long shot. In his command bunker in East Prussia, Adolf Hitler watched the map with growing fury. Nancy was falling. Patton was advancing. The entire German position in Lorraine was collapsing. Hitler, in one of his increasingly common rages, ordered a massive counterattack. He sent the 5th Panzer Army, brand new Panther tanks, fresh crews pulled from training schools, the last mobile reserve in the West, to crush Patton's bridgehead and save Nancy. This wasn't just a skirmish. This wasn't a local counterattack. This was the Empire striking back with everything it had left. The Germans were committing over 200 tanks to destroy Old Blood and Guts once and for all. On September 18, 1944, near the town of Arracourt, 30 miles east of Nancy, the German Panthers emerged from the morning fog like prehistoric monsters. Their long 75mm guns could kill a Sherman at 2,000 yards. Their armor could shrug off most United States tank rounds. They outnumbered the Americans. They outgunned them. They should have won. George Smith Patton's flank was exposed. If the Germans broke through at Arracourt, they would cut off the 4th Armored Division and relieve Nancy. Everything Old Blood and Guts had accomplished would be undone. 30,000 United States soldiers would be encircled and destroyed. What followed was the Battle of Arracourt, the largest tank battle involving United States forces on the Western Front. It should have been a slaughter. The American Shermans couldn't penetrate the front armor of a Panther, but the Americans had 3 things the Germans didn't: better radios that allowed instant communication between tanks, fog that negated the Panther's long-range advantage, and better trained crews who had been fighting together for months. The Americans played a deadly game of cat and mouse in the fog. They used the limited visibility to sneak around the flanks of the German heavy tanks, shooting them in the rear engines where the armor was thinner. They coordinated attacks, using one platoon to distract while another flanked. It was brutal, intimate combat at ranges of 100 yards or less. Colonel Abrams was in the thick of it, his tank advancing through the fog, hunting Panthers. At one point, his Sherman came face to face with a Panther at 50 yards. The German fired first, but the fog had confused his range estimation. The shell screamed over Abrams' turret. Abrams' gunner didn't miss. The armor-piercing round punched through the Panther's side armor. It brewed up, flames shooting from every hatch. For 4 days, from September 18th to September 21st, 1944, the hills of Lorraine burned with destroyed tanks. George Smith Patton personally visited the front lines multiple times, standing in the open despite the danger, watching the battle through binoculars. His aides begged him to take cover. He refused. "How can I ask my boys to fight if I won't share the danger?" Old Blood and Guts said. "They need to see me. They need to know their commander is here." Watching the reports in his command post, Patton was almost gleeful. He wrote in his diary, "The Krauts are trying to beat us at our own game. Mobile warfare, armored combat. They're going to regret it. This is what the 3rd Army was born to do." By September 21st, the 5th Panzer Army was destroyed. Over 200 German tanks were burning wrecks scattered across the Lorraine countryside. The path to Nancy was secure. The German counterattack, Hitler's last gamble in the West, had failed catastrophically. This is why they called him Old Blood and Guts. Because when the situation looked darkest, when defeat seemed certain, George Smith Patton found a way to win. Not through caution, not through patience, but through aggressive, relentless, forward momentum that gave the enemy no time to recover. Back in Nancy, the end had come. The German garrison commander, Colonel Heinrich Müller, knew he was encircled. The Battle of Arracourt had failed to break the United States ring. Creighton Abrams tanks controlled the roads east. The Moselle bridges behind him were in enemy hands. Supplies weren't getting through. Ammunition was running low. On the night of September 15, 1944, Müller made a decision that would save his surviving men's lives but infuriate Adolf Hitler. He disobeyed the Führer's explicit orders to fight to the last man and hold Nancy at all costs. The Germans began to slip away under cover of darkness. They rigged the bridges across the Moselle to blow. Demolition charges were placed on the beautiful spans that crossed the river. The explosives were wired to detonators. One push of a button, and the bridges, and with them, George Smith Patton's entire momentum, would be destroyed. But Old Blood and Guts' speed had been too great. The French resistance fighters, emboldened by the American approach, had been watching. They knew where the German engineers had placed the charges. In one of the war's most daring operations, resistance fighters crawled through the night and cut the wires on the main bridges. They disarmed charges under the noses of German sentries. Some were caught and killed, but enough succeeded. When the German engineers pressed their detonators on September 16, 1944, most of the bridges didn't explode. They stood intact. The mayor of Nancy sat in his office on the morning of September 16th listening. The heavy boots that had occupied his city for 4 years were leaving. The rumble of German trucks was fading. He heard different engines now, United States engines, Sherman tanks. The sound was getting closer. The liberation of Nancy was one of the strangest in the entire war. There was no bombardment. There was no storming of the gates that the mayor had refused to open. There was no house-to-house fighting. George Smith Patton's troops simply arrived. They walked into the Place Stanislas, the golden square that had been the mayor's greatest fear. The Baroque architecture was untouched. The gates were intact. The cathedral stood proud. Lieutenant James Henderson of the 35th Infantry Division was among the first to enter the main square. He expected resistance. He expected booby traps. Instead, he found French civilians emerging from their homes, tears streaming down their faces. An old woman ran up to him and kissed both his cheeks, babbling in French he didn't understand. Within minutes, and the square was filled with celebrating civilians. The mayor, accompanied by local officials, rushed out to meet the Americans. He was weeping. He expected the United States commander to be furious with him. He expected to be arrested for obstruction. After all, he had refused to open the gates. He had asked the Americans to go away, and yet his city stood intact. General George Smith Patton arrived in Nancy on September 19, 1944. His jeep rolled through streets lined with cheering French citizens, waving American and French flags. Children threw flowers, women wept, men saluted. Old Blood and Guts stood in his jeep, acknowledging the crowd, his pearl-handled pistols gleaming in the autumn sun. He dismounted in the Place Stanislas, one of the most beautiful public squares in all of Europe. The golden gates that gave the city its nickname sparkled in the light. The Baroque buildings stood proud and undamaged. George Smith Patton slowly turned in a circle, taking it all in. Then he looked at his staff officers and grinned. "Well, gentlemen," Old Blood and Guts said, "I guess we didn't need the key after all." The French officials approached nervously, led by the mayor. The mayor began a prepared speech in broken English, apologizing for his refusal to cooperate, explaining his fears, begging forgiveness. George Smith Patton held up his hand, stopping the speech. "Mr. Mayor, do you know what you did?" The mayor looked confused, frightened. I refused your entry, General. I closed the gates to—" "You forced me to be smart," Patton interrupted. "If you had opened those gates, I probably would have driven straight in. The Krauts would have fought us house to house. Your beautiful city would have been destroyed, and a lot of my boys would have died. But you said no. You forced me to go around, and by going around, I trapped the entire German garrison. You saved your city and helped me win the battle. So, thank you." The mayor stared, unable to believe what he was hearing. "Of course," George Smith Patton continued, his eyes twinkling. "If you tell anyone that I thanked you for telling me no, I'll deny it. Old Blood and Guts doesn't thank people for saying no. Understood?" The mayor laughed, relief flooding through him. "Understood, General." Patton turned to his operations officer. "Colonel, make sure we set up a supply depot here. Get the engineers to reinforce those bridges the resistance saved. And find out which of those French resistance fighters cut those demolition wires. I want to personally decorate them." This was George Smith Patton at his best. Aggressive in battle, gracious in victory. He understood that the mayor had been trying to save his city. He understood that sometimes obstacles force you to find better solutions. And he understood that giving credit to others, even former opponents, was the mark of true leadership. Over the next few days, as the Third Army consolidated its hold on Nancy and prepared for the next phase of operations, the full scope of what Old Blood and Guts had accomplished became clear. The Battle of Nancy had cost the Third Army thousands of casualties, not in the city itself, but in the brutal river crossings and the massive tank battles in the surrounding hills. But they had achieved something remarkable. They had encircled and destroyed an entire German corps. They had captured a major city intact, and they had proven, once again, that when you told George Smith Patton he couldn't do something, you just motivated him to prove you wrong. The days following the liberation of Nancy revealed the true magnitude of what General George Smith Patton had accomplished. As intelligence officers sorted through captured German documents and interrogated prisoners, the strategic picture became crystal clear. The Third Army had destroyed or captured over 15,000 German soldiers. They had knocked out more than 300 tanks and self-propelled guns. They had captured enough supplies to equip an entire division. General Omar Bradley, Patton's superior and commander of the 12th Army Group, has visited Nancy on September 23, 1944. He toured the undamaged city center, met with the grateful French officials, and then sat down with Old Blood and Guts in the requisitioned headquarters. "George, I have to hand it to you," Bradley said, studying the battle maps. "When that mayor refused entry and you decided to encircle instead of assault, I thought you were being stubborn, but it was brilliant. You trapped them all." George Smith Patton lit a cigar and leaned back in his chair. "Brad, let me tell you something I learned a long time ago. When someone tells you no, they're usually telling you to find a better way. That mayor didn't want his city destroyed. Fair enough. So I found a way to take the city without destroying it. Everybody wins except the Krauts." "Still," Bradley continued, the casualties at the river crossings were heavy. Some people back in Washington are questioning whether what?" Patton interrupted, his voice hardening. "Whether we should have waited? Whether we should have let the Germans fortify every river from here to Berlin? Brad, every day we don't fight is a day United States soldiers die somewhere else. Every German we don't kill here will kill some American kid later. I don't have the luxury of caution, neither do you." Bradley sighed. He had heard this argument before. George Smith Patton saw war with a clarity that sometimes disturbed his colleagues. Old Blood and Guts understood that the quickest way to end the killing was to kill the enemy faster than they could regroup. It was brutal logic, but it was effective. More revealing were the interrogations of captured German officers. A colonel from the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division, captured during the breakout attempt, was interviewed by United States intelligence officers on September 24, 1944. "We knew Patton was commanding opposite us," the German colonel said through a translator. "That changed everything. We couldn't prepare defenses fast enough. He moves too quickly, attacks where you don't expect. When we heard American tanks were behind Nancy, we knew it was over. Only Patton does that. Only he has the nerve." This became a common theme in German prisoner interrogations. The mere presence of George Smith Patton on a section of the front changed German planning. They had to commit more reserves, build stronger defenses, expect the unexpected. And Old Blood and Guts was worth several divisions just through the psychological effect of his reputation. The United States press, which had been relatively quiet about the Third Army's operations due to security restrictions, began publishing stories about the Nancy campaign in early October 1944. The headlines were glowing. "Patton outsmarts Germans again. Third Army traps entire corps. Old Blood and Guts does it again." War correspondent Ernie Pyle, beloved by United States soldiers, wrote a column about the Nancy operation that was published in hundreds of newspapers back home. He wrote, "General George Smith Patton is the most aggressive commander in the European theater. Some call him reckless, but I've watched his boys, and they don't think he's reckless. They think he's a winner. And in war, winning is what matters. The people of Nancy are celebrating their liberation in an intact city because Patton was smart enough to go around instead of through. That's not recklessness, that's genius. The strategic significance of Nancy extended far beyond the immediate battle. By securing the Moselle River crossings and defeating the 5th Panzer Army's counterattack at Arracourt, George Smith Patton had opened the door to the Saar region and ultimately to the Rhine River itself. The Third Army was now positioned to strike into Germany itself. More importantly, old blood and guts had proven that the German army, even when defending favorable terrain, could not stop the United States Third Army. The Wehrmacht had been given 5 days to prepare defenses around Nancy, 5 days that Patton bitterly resented losing to the fuel shortage. And they had used those days to build what should have been an impregnable position. And George Smith Patton had cracked it in less than 2 weeks. The military historians would later study the Nancy campaign as a textbook example of mobile warfare and the indirect approach. Rather than attacking the enemy's strength, Patton had isolated it and rendered it irrelevant. The German garrison in Nancy had been neutralized not by frontal assault, but by maneuver. This was Patton's genius. He understood that the objective wasn't to capture ground or destroy fortifications. The objective was to destroy the enemy's ability to fight. Everything else was secondary. General George Marshall, the United States Army Chief of Staff, received detailed reports about the Nancy operation in Washington. In a confidential memo to President Franklin Delano Roosevelt dated October 5, 1944, Marshall wrote, "General Patton continues to demonstrate why he is our premier combat commander. The Nancy operation showed creativity, aggression, and tactical flexibility. While his personal behavior sometimes causes concerns, his military results are beyond question." Even British commanders, sometimes skeptical of American generalship, were impressed. Field Marshal Alan Brooke, chief of the Imperial General Staff, wrote in his diary after reading intelligence summaries, "Patton's movement around Nancy was first-rate soldiering. He refused to be stopped by obstacles and found a way through. This is the type of leadership that wins wars." But perhaps the most telling assessment came from the German side. After the war, when Allied intelligence officers interviewed senior Wehrmacht commanders, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, overall commander of German forces in the West, was asked which Allied general he feared most. "Patton," von Rundstedt answered without hesitation. Always Patton. He was unpredictable, aggressive, and fast. We could never pin him down. The moment we thought we had him contained, he was behind us. Nancy was typical Patton. We prepared for a frontal assault, and he appeared in our rear, militarily brilliant. This was the ultimate validation. The enemy feared George Smith Patton more than any other Allied commander. Old blood and guts had gotten into the German High Command's head. They spent more time worrying about what Patton might do than actually fighting him effectively. Psychological warfare at its finest. The Battle of Nancy also demonstrated why the United States military continues to study George Smith Patton's operations today. At the United States Army Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, the Nancy campaign is taught as part of the curriculum on mobile warfare. Officers study how Patton overcame the fuel shortage, exploited the river crossing at Dieulouard, and defeated the Arracourt counterattack. The lessons are still relevant nearly 80 years later. Maintain momentum, exploit success, keep the enemy off balance, and never accept no for an answer. Today, if you visit Nancy, you can see the Liberation Monument in the Place Stanislas. It's a simple memorial, but it tells a complex story. It commemorates the American soldiers who liberated the city and the French resistance fighters who saved the bridges. And though it doesn't say so explicitly, it's a monument to what happens when a French mayor says no, and an American general says, "Watch me." You can walk across those bridges that the resistance saved. Stand on the Moselle River and imagine what the 80th Infantry Division faced in those dark September nights in 1944. The water still flows swiftly, the banks are still steep. It's immediately clear why the Germans thought it was an impregnable defense. If you drive east from Nancy to the town of Arracourt, you can still find pieces of rusted Panther tank treads in the mud of farm fields. The local farmers occasionally plow up shell casings, tank parts, and grim reminders of September 1944, when the fields burned with the largest tank battle the United States Army fought on the Western Front. There's a small museum in Arracourt now, dedicated to the battle. Old photographs show the destroyed German Panthers, their long guns pointing uselessly at the sky, testament to old blood and guts and his boys. The Nancy campaign encapsulates everything that made General George Smith Patton legendary. His refusal to accept obstacles as permanent, his ability to turn an enemy's defensive advantage into a trap, his aggressive leadership style that inspired United States soldiers to attempt what other armies considered impossible, and his understanding that speed and momentum are weapons as powerful as tanks and artillery. The mayor had been right to be afraid. If the battle had been fought differently, Nancy could have been destroyed. But George Smith Patton was also right to attack. The bypassing Nancy would have left a German garrison in his rear, threatened his supply lines, and delayed the entire Third Army. The question wasn't whether to neutralize Nancy. The question was how. And Old Blood and Guts found the answer that saved both the city and accomplished the military objective. This is why George Smith Patton remains the most studied American combat commander of World War II. This is why United States military academies continue to teach his campaigns. This is why soldiers still invoke his name, because he proved over and over that audacity works, that aggression, when properly channeled, saves lives by shortening wars, that the word impossible just means nobody's tried hard enough yet. The survival of Nancy was written by the stubbornness of two men who refused to compromise, a French mayor who said, "You cannot enter," and an American general who said, "Watch me find another way." History is filled with immovable objects meeting unstoppable forces. Nancy is the story of what happens when the unstoppable force is smart enough to go around the immovable object. General George Smith Patton, Old Blood and Guts, the man who terrified German generals and inspired American soldiers, the general who believed that no defense was impregnable and no obstacle was permanent, proved at Nancy that sometimes a closed gate is an opportunity in disguise. The mayor forced him to be creative. The terrain forced him to be tactical. The Germans forced him to be brilliant. And George Smith Patton proved, once again, why they called him the greatest combat commander the United States has ever produced. From the beaches of Normandy to the Rhine River, from Sicily to Bavaria, Old Blood and Guts left a trail of defeated German armies and liberated cities. But Nancy stands out because it was the battle that didn't have to be fought. The mayor tried to prevent it. The Germans thought they had made it impossible. The terrain seemed to forbid it. And yet, George Smith Patton found a way. He always found a way. This is the legacy of Old Blood and Guts. Not just the victories, but how he achieved them. Not just the ground captured, but how quickly he moved. Not just the enemies defeated, but how thoroughly he outthought them. General George Smith Patton understood war at a level few commanders ever reach. He understood that war is about will as much as weapons, about speed as much as strength, about finding the enemy's weakness and exploiting it before he can react. And that is why, when that French mayor refused to open the city gates in September of 1944, George Smith Patton simply smiled, looked at his maps, and found another way in. Because that's what legends do. They don't accept limitations. They don't accept no. They find a way or they make one. If this story of how Old Blood and Guts turned a refusal into an opportunity, how he transformed a closed gate into a tactical masterpiece, and how he liberated Nancy without destroying it has moved you, then hit that subscribe button. We're bringing you more untold stories from General George Smith Patton, the man they called Old Blood and Guts. As history's greatest combat commander, these are the stories they don't teach in school. These are the moments that define the greatest generation. And we're bringing them to you, one incredible tale at a time. What would you have done if you were in George Smith Patton's position? Would you have respected the mayor's wish and bypassed Nancy, risking your supply lines and momentum? Or would you have done what Old Blood and Guts did? Found the third option that nobody else could see? Let us know in the comments below. And remember, the next time someone tells you something is impossible, channel your inner George Smith Patton. Find another way. Because as Old Blood and Guts prove time and time again, the only impossible missions are the ones you never attempt. This has been the story of what General George Smith Patton did when a French mayor refused to open the city gates. The answer? He didn't need the gates. He made his own doors. And that's why they called him Old Blood and Guts.